Welcome to the fourth episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward III of England. In Part 4, The Great Army of the Sea, we will talk about Edward III's victories in Scotland and the beginning of the 100 Years' War. In the on-again, off-again war between England and Scotland during the 14th century, King Edward III of England recognized Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne over that of King David II, son of Robert the Bruce. When civil war erupted between the two men, Edward III moved to York and assembled an army. There he pioneered the use of fast-moving mounted archers. In spring 1333, King Edward III and Balliol led 8,000 men in besieging the Scottish town of Berwick. On July 19th, a Scottish force of 15,000 under Sir Archibald Douglas arrived to relieve the town. Just after midday, the Scots advanced across boggy ground to meet the English, who were positioned on Halidon Hill, a few miles north of Berwick. When the Scots reached the foot of the hill, the English greeted them with cloud after cloud of arrows. English archers slaughtered the tightly packed Scottish schiltrons. Fierce fighting continued throughout the day, with the Earl of Ross and his Highlanders fighting to the death in a desperate rearguard action. King Edward III himself fought hand-to-hand with Robert Stewart, grandson of Robert the Bruce. King Edward's victory at Halidon Hill proved so complete that he could put Edward Balliol on the Scottish throne, reclaimed Berwick for the English, and snatched up the Scottish lowlands. He spent the rest of 1333 in the southeast of England, hunting and holding tournaments. It seemed absurdly easy, and of course, it wasn't. The deposed Scottish King David II and his family went to France, where they lived in Chateau Gaillard, the great fortress built by Richard the Lionheart more than a century ago. Back in Scotland, the Civil War resumed under young Robert Stewart and the Earl of Moray. By springtime, King Edward III returned to York and resumed the war in Scotland, this time on behalf of his puppet king Edward Balliol. In July 1336, Edward III burnished his chivalric fame by saving a group of ladies held prisoner at Lochendorb Castle. The rest of the war saw little such chivalry, as Edward's men burned, looted, and murdered, with no greater purpose than demoralizing and impoverishing the subjects of Robert Stewart. The war dragged on in part because King Philip VI of France supported the Scots in their rebellion against Edward Balliol. But why did the King of France care who ruled in Scotland? Because King Philip VI wanted Gascony, a rich strip of coastal farmland on France's Atlantic coast near the Spanish border. It held an important place in the English economy, making wine that the English traded with the Flemish for wool. At the time of Edward's birth, the kings of England claimed overlordship of several regions in France. Before ruling England, the Plantagenet family had been French nobles. As such, they claimed the Duchy of Aquitaine, though that made them vassals to the King of France, at least according to the French. This tangled web of feudal claims and loyalties would soon explode into war. In March 1337, King Edward III called Parliament at Westminster. There, the peers buzzed with excitement over the upcoming creation of new lords, reform of the wool trade, and great tournaments to be held. King Edward III fostered good feelings by telling the assembled lords that, among the marks of royalty, we consider it to be chief that, through a due distribution of positions, dignities, and offices, it is buttressed by wise counsels and fortified by mighty powers. In that parliament, Edward III rewarded faithful subjects who served him in the 1330 coup and the Scottish Wars by creating 6 new earls. Since Edward's eldest son, to be known as the Black Prince, was now 6 years old, the king made him Duke of Cornwall. The royal family held a magnificent feast to celebrate the new peers and dubbed 20 knights. Yet this wasn't just good times. War was coming, and King Edward would need allies. In 1337, King Philip VI of France wanted to expand his borders and spread his political power. When King Edward III granted refuge to Robert d'Artois, who had fled the French court, King Philip VI had an excuse to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine, the ancient property of the Plantagenet kings, and the same one that Edward had paid homage for during his teenage years. In response, Edward III not only demanded his estates back, but he also claimed the Kingdom of France itself. A bit of pro-French propaganda called the Vows of the Heron claimed that Robert d'Artois goaded Edward III into declaring war by giving him a roasted heron, supposedly the most cowardly bird, and thus one fit for a king unwilling to fight Philip VI. Of course, to fight King Philip VI, first Edward III had to cross the English Channel. That proved tricky, as King Philip VI hired a slew of galleys from Genoa, an Italian city-state. He sent them on devastating raids against southern English ports, and they sent English towns like Hastings and Portsmouth up in flames. They even captured King Edward's great ships, the Cog Edward and the Christopher. King Philip VI even planned an invasion of England in 1339, but a storm scattered his fleet. After this storm, the French position changed for the worse. Philip's Genoese mercenaries began fighting amongst themselves over the spoils of war. When the oarsmen felt cheated, they mutinied and went home, losing the French 2/3 of their battle fleet. King Edward III then launched a surprise attack on Boulogne in early 1340 that burned 18 of the 22 remaining royal galleys. King Philip VI, growing desperate, dragooned merchant ships into service and armed them, creating what he called a great army of the sea. He financed these 200 ships with a heavy tax imposed on Normandy. In the meantime, King Edward III assembled a fleet of 160 ships. This fleet, commanded by Edward III in person, sailed for Flanders on June 22, 1340. Archbishop Stratford begged him to stay home, but Edward left with the rebuke, "Those who are afraid can stay home." The French feared the English army landing above all else, so they blockaded the mouth of the river's Win to stop a potential English landing. When Edward III first saw them, he saw the great army of the sea anchored and chained together in 3 lines across the river's mouth. After a night spent anchored in sight of the forest of masts, Edward ordered his ships to approach from the southwest, the sun and wind behind them. He faced a huge French fleet carrying hundreds of crossbowmen. The sea battle unfolded much like a land battle, with little maneuvering and plenty of close-quarters fighting. The French commanders doomed themselves by choosing to shackle their ships together, ensuring that only a third of their force would fight at a time. English ships rammed French vessels, attaching with hooks and grappling irons, while archers exchanged fire. In a single day, Edward III wiped out the French fleet and made the Channel English. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.